Ray Kurzweil, I think almost any introduction runs the risk of understating his significance of this. He's basically been the inspiration for this whole event. As was already mentioned, his recent book, The Singularity is Near, drives this premise home that we are in this world of exponentiating growth. Isaiah Berlin, the philosopher Isaiah Berlin, distinguished between two types of intellectual thinkers. There were foxes who knew many little things, and there was the hedgehog who knows one big thing. And I think of Kurzweil as a hedgehog who knows one big thing, and that is applying exponential math relentlessly and ruthlessly to technological innovation and change, and extrapolating where that will go. And that one big thing, has led him to work on many interesting projects and many accomplishments. I'll just list a few of them here. He was described as the ultimate thinking machine by Forbes, one of 16 revolutionaries who made America by PBS. He was the principal developer of the first CCD flatbed scanner, the first Omnifont OCR, the first print-to-speech reading machine for the blind, the first text-to-speech synthesizer, the first music synthesizer capable of recreating the grand piano and other orchestral instruments, the first commercial large vocabulary speech recognition system. He has received 12 honorary doctorates, the Lemelson Prize, the world's largest for innovation, the National Medal of Technology, the Dixon Prize. He's been inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame and has honors from 3 U.S. presidents. Without too much further ado, I would like to introduce Ray Kurzweil and get the event off to start. Thanks a lot.
Well, thanks for that warm welcome. Thanks for all coming out. I can't actually see to the back of the room. And I'm looking forward to a spirited discussion of these events. And actually, speaking of how when AI solves a problem, we then tend to put down the problem. It's not that important after all. AI has actually been defined as the set of problems that we haven't solved yet. As soon as we solve it, it loses its mystery. Intelligence has a mystery, so if we know the solution of the problem, that can't really be intelligence. So it was very mysterious how a car could actually be driven by intelligence. Only humans could do that, and I was actually challenged recently at the Gilder conference because I had predicted a car would do that, and it was pointed out how pathetic all the DARPA cars were running off the road quickly. And I said, well, there's a surge of progress at the end, and very soon you'll see this happen. And thanks to Sebastian and his team, his car led 5 cars that completed that course. Because now we say that, oh, well, that's not really intelligent after all. So, and one by one, I think there's no silver bullet. AI is getting stronger, and I'm going to make that point again this morning. I'd like to start by reading a passage from my book and actually demonstrating a new product.
The system is on. Camera is off. I'm ready. Camera is on. Field of view report. Top and right edges are visible. 6. Taking picture.
This is a new product. It's a couple hundred blind guys and gals who are running around
Pre-processing picture.
reading the labels on their clothing, signs on the wall, soup cans.
Camera is 3 degrees clockwise relative to the page.
Corrects for 3 different degrees of freedom of rotation and tilt.
Page 1, GNR 289. The AI winter is long since over. We are well into the spring of narrow AI. Most of the examples above were research projects just 10 to 15 years ago. If all the AI systems in the world suddenly stopped functioning, our economic infrastructure would grind to a halt. Your bank would cease doing business. Most transportation would be crippled. Most communications would fail. This was not the case a decade ago. Of course, our AI systems are not smart enough yet to organize such a conspiracy. Strong AI If you understand something in only one way, then you don't really understand it at all. Speaking cancelled.
So that's
Camera is off. An unsaved document. Goodbye.
We developed this with the National Federation of the Blind. We did the research, and actually an interesting point is we tried this 5 years ago, and we anticipated what the hardware would be like. So we took actually a large computer that was simulated what we felt would be available in a PDA 5 years hence, and those projections were accurate. A high-end camera that had 4 megapixels, and the hardware was there. The software was not. We really couldn't manage the requisite algorithms to handle the vagaries of real-world print taken from a digital camera, 3 different degrees of freedom of tilt and rotation, uneven illumination, curved images, and so on was not feasible 5 years ago. And it's one of many examples, and I'll mention a number of others. There are actually hundreds in my book, of how software and AI has progressed. People say, well, where are all these AI applications? It's a little bit like people who go into the rainforest and say, where are all these species that are supposed to be here? When there's 50 species of ants within 50 feet of them, but they're deeply integrated into the ecological infrastructure. And we have hundreds of examples of narrow AI deeply integrated into our economic infrastructure. Every time you send an email or connect a cell phone call, intelligent algorithms route the information. Intelligent algorithms design products, control just-in-time inventory, assemble products, land airplanes, guide intelligent weapon systems, make billions of dollars of financial transactions automatically every day, and many other examples. And these were research projects when we met in 1999 at the Spiritual Machines Conference that was mentioned. We are making progress. There's no silver bullet. But hardware and software are progressing at an exponential pace. In fact, 7 years ago at this conference, it was said that, well, computers can't even tell the difference between a cat and a dog. And in fact, the progression in AI has been the opposite of the maturation of human intelligence. A little child will learn the difference between a cat and a dog. It's not until we're adults that we can do things like solve mathematical theorems. And Carnegie Mellon's general problem solver in the 1950s solved mathematical theorems that Russell and Whitehead had been unable to solve, and so it was felt that it wouldn't be long before computers could do anything if they could do that. But in fact, the really challenging parts of human intelligence are the tasks that young children can do, particularly our pattern recognition. That's the strength of human intelligence. That's how Kasparov plays chess. He doesn't build this tree of billions of move, counter-move positions. He was said, well, Deep Blue does 300 million board positions a second in terms of move, counter-move sequences. How many can you do a second? He said 1, maybe less. How is it that he holds a candle to machines? It's that the power of pattern recognition. That is really the heart of human intelligence. Well, in fact, computers now can tell the difference between a cat and a dog. We're going to be adding a feature to this product so a blind person can snap a picture and it'll tell them there's a cat in front of you, there's a lamp to your left, your ex-wife is over to the right, because we are in fact adding face recognition. And why is it that we can tell the difference between a cat and a dog now with a computer that we couldn't do that 7 years ago? 2 things. Pattern recognition algorithms have gotten steadily more sophisticated, and we also have this tremendous data mining that we didn't have 7 years ago. You need a lot of data to train these pattern recognition algorithms. So if you want 1 million pictures of cats and dogs, I mean, you know exactly where to get them. There are, in fact, 3 million pictures of dogs on Google. It's a nice game to try to guess how many pictures of different things are up there. There are more pictures of cats, 3.6 million. And so you can train these algorithms. You'd be hard-pressed to find 1,000 pictures of cats and dogs 7 years ago. And in fact, the National Federation of the Blind, with whom we worked with on this project, has 2 projects. This pocket-sized reader, and their other project is a car that blind people can drive. And when that was announced 4 years ago, that was considered ridiculous. It's not considered ridiculous anymore. We're not ready to turn the keys of cars over to blind people, but it's now seen to be a very reasonable project, and Sebastian, they're going to be in touch with you soon, because I gave them your name. So underlying this is an exponential theory, the law of accelerating returns, which does say that information technology progresses exponentially. It's important to understand, first of all, this is specific to information technology, so people very often pose, oh, here's some exponential trend, and that didn't progress exponentially. Exponential trends don't necessarily just keep on going. This is not relevant to things like population, which is not an information technology. In fact, information technology thwarted it because the economic progress we've made has been largely due to the economic cost effectiveness of information technology, and as soon as societies become wealthy, the population growth stops. But information technologies progress, but doesn't an exponential hit a wall, like rabbits in Australia? That's true of information technologies. A specific paradigm will run out of steam and hit a wall, but then it leads to another paradigm, and I'm going to show you that a little bit later. Moore's law was not the first. It was the fifth paradigm to bring exponential growth to computing. Well, isn't there an ultimate limit to the ability of information technology to progress? And yes, I discuss that in detail in the book. There are limits based on what we know about physics, to the ability of information technology to progress, both in computation, communication, biological technologies, and so on. But the limits are not very limiting. 1 cubic inch of nanotube circuitry would be millions of times more powerful than the amount of computation required to simulate all regions of the brain based on the most conservative estimates of that amount of computation. And nanotubes are not speculative. Nanotube circuits are working. There's a very large, dense nanotube circuit working that has self-organizing features that's set to hit the market next year, so this is not speculative types of technology. But even if you were skeptical about the ability of molecular three-dimensional computing to be feasible, and I don't think that's actually a reasonable skepticism given recent progress of these circuits actually working, and as I say, one set to hit the market. Just conventional two-dimensional chips, according to the ITRS roadmap that has been followed quite rigorously for several decades, projects 4 nanometer features. We're now at 65, 50 is working, 35 is being developed. 4 nanometer features are for 2018. That will provide, if you use application-specific integrated circuits, enough computation, 10 to the 16th calculations per second, to emulate all regions of the brain based on the most conservative estimates for $1,000. So you don't even need molecular computing, although that is quite feasible. This is a scientific theory. I actually got into this because I realized that projecting technology trends was key to being successful as an inventor, and I did that for that purpose, and I still do that primarily for this reason. We started this project at the Reader 5 years ago because we projected it would be feasible in 5 years. I have a team now of 10 people that gathers data in different areas, and I've been developing this theory for 25 years. It's part of a broader theory of evolution. But Moore's law, which the public is aware of, is really just one example of many of this exponential progression. And people think intuitively in a linear manner. I think that's hardwired. We see what's in front of us. We project that linearly. One scientist I was debating with him the pace of progress in brain reverse engineering. And he was saying, well, it took me 18 months to model this one ion channel, and there's 4 other ion channels in this particular type of dendrite, so that's 5 times 18, and then this other dendrite has 6 other ion channels, and he's adding all this up, and 20 times 18 months, and it'll be a century before we finish this project. As if the computers we have to simulate these processes will stay the same, the pace of progress will be the same for the next 100 years. The reality is we're doubling the spatial resolution in 3D volume of brain scanners every year. It's only recently that we can see inside the brain with sufficient resolution to see individual interneuronal connections. And the same skepticism was expressed about the Genome Project. When that project was started, we had only collected 1/10,000th of the genome. Halfway through the project, skeptics said, I told you this wasn't going to work. I mean, here you are 7.5 years into a 15-year project, and you finished 1% of the project. But you double 1% 7 times, you get to 100%. That's exactly what happened. We exactly doubled every year the amount of genetic data we sequenced. It took us 15 years to sequence HIV. We sequenced SARS in 31 days. And there's many examples. If you can measure something in information, it inherently grows exponentially. But our intuition is linear. And so lots of people think intuitively and said, well, the kind of projections you get for an exponential trend just seem incredible, but that is really how the technology and every different manifestation of information technology has progressed. The paradigm shift rates doubling every decade. The telephone took 50 years to be adopted. That was the first virtual reality technology. Before that, you really had to be in the same place to hold a conversation with somebody. Cell phones did that in 7 years. These are logarithmic graphs. A straight line on a logarithmic graph is exponential growth. These early communication technologies took decades to be adopted. More recent ones took a few years' time. And this acceleration has continued. I mean, the word blogs wasn't used 3 years ago. People didn't use search engines 5 or 6 years ago. Social networks are new. 3 years ago, people said, you can't make money in internet advertising. Now you've got one company started here on this campus that's worth $100 billion. 99% of its revenue comes from internet advertising. So the pace of change is accelerating. And I don't really have time to dwell on this, but as I say, this is part of a theory of evolution. Evolution creates a capability and then uses that capability to advance the next stage, and that's why an evolutionary process accelerates. So the first paradigm shift on this double logarithmic graph took billions of years, but then evolution used DNA, an information backbone, to guide the next stage. So the Cambrian explosion went 100 times faster, and biological evolution kept accelerating. And Homo sapiens took only a few 100,000 years to evolve, and there's only 3 simple genetic changes comprising tens of thousands of bytes of information that really distinguish us from other primates. A larger skull at the expense of a weaker jaw, so don't get into a biting contest with another primate. More of the cerebral cortex is devoted to the more of the brain is devoted to the cerebral cortex, so we could do abstract reasoning. There are things like mirror neurons, particular neural structures that can deal with recursion, which are also important in humans' ability to create hierarchical symbolic structures. And the thumb actually works. A chimpanzee's hand, the thumb is an inch down. They don't have a power grip. They don't have fine motor coordination. They can't manipulate the environment. These tens of thousands of bytes of genetic information comprising these changes is really the enabling factors that brought on the next evolutionary process, which was human-directed technological and cultural evolution. And that was a little bit faster. That only took tens of thousands of years for stone tool, fire, the wheel. And then we always use the latest generation of technology to advance the next stage. And so technological evolution also continued to accelerate. It comes out in a straight line, really, from the biological evolution that preceded it. And if you look at this on a linear graph, it looks like everything has just happened. But people said, okay, Kurzweil only put points on this graph that fit on the straight line. So I took 14 different lists, Carl Sagan's Cosmic Calendar, the American Museum of Natural History, Encyclopedia Britannica. And these weren't lists trying to make or break my point. This is just what they thought the key events were. And you see there's some spreading the points, but there's a clear trend line. And an exponential, this is a linear graph, looks like a linear progression for a few years. You go out for a long period of time, and the perspectives diverge quite radically. And the further out you go, the more unrealistic a linear perspective becomes. And the ongoing exponential is made of a series of S-curves, each one representing a specific paradigm. So if we look at, well, a personal experience, a computer that took up, it's about half the size of this room when I came to MIT in '65, $11 million. It's about 1,000 times less powerful than the computer in your cell phone today. But Moore's law is really one example of many. It was the 5th paradigm to bring exponential growth to computing. This goes back to the lower left-hand corner, the first data processing equipment to automate an American census, use these old punch card machines. I think they were subsequently shipped to the Florida Election Commission. I'm going to leave out the rest of my jokes just to make the time frame here. But Alan Turing created a relay-based computer that cracked the German Enigma code. Then vacuum tubes were used in the 1950s. They were then shrinking vacuum tubes to make them smaller and smaller and to keep this exponential growth going. And that paradigm hit a wall. And that was the end of the shrinking of vacuum tubes. It was not the end of the exponential growth of computing. We went to another paradigm, transistors, which are not small tubes, and then to integrated circuits. So Moore's law, the shrinking of transistors and integrated circuit, was the 5th paradigm to bring exponential growth. And there's been lots of projections that will hit a wall. The first projections were 2002. Intel now says, and the ITRS roadmap say 2022. By that time, the key features on conventional chips using photolithography. Just like today, 4-nanometer features, you'll be able to do strong AI based on the most conservative estimates of the amount of computation required for about $1,000. That's with no molecular computing. But molecular computing is working already. There are early versions due to hit the market. If you speak to Intel scientists, they're very confident of that particular paradigm. So we're not talking about any other exotic technologies. We can speculate what might happen after the singularity and go into things like quantum computing and pico computing, but that's not really at issue here. We can even do it without molecular computing, but molecular computing is really, that was somewhat speculative when we met 7 years ago at the Spiritual Machines Conference. It's really very much a mainstream view today among the scientists working on that field. These are different computers. This is Hans Moravec's chart, same progression. Supercomputers marching along. Generally, my projections, even though they're considered in some quarters radical, end up very often being conservative. My book, which came out half a year ago, projected 2013 to hit 10 to the 16th calculations per second. Japan recently announced 2 supercomputer projects to hit that level by 2010. And I don't want to dwell on these in the interest of time, but this is the price of a transistor. You could buy a whole transistor for $1 in 1968, and if you back up to when I was hanging around the surplus electronics shops on Canal Street in New York in the early 60s, I bought something this big for $40, equivalent to 1 transistor. It was a telephone relay with support circuitry, only very slow. And you then could buy a whole fast transistor for $1 in 1968, 10 million in 2002, 100 million today. But look at how smooth this progression is. It looks like the output of some tabletop experiment. But this is the measure of worldwide activity involving millions of people. Now you might wonder, how could that be? How can you get such smooth and predictable curves from the chaotic activity of lots of people when any specific project is very unpredictable? We see a similar phenomena in other areas of science like thermodynamics. The path of one particle in a gas is completely unpredictable, yet the overall gas, made up of a large number of chaotically interacting particles, has very predictable properties according to the laws of thermodynamics to a very high degree of precision. If you have a dynamic, chaotic system where each element, each project, each technology project is unpredictable, the overall results will have certain predictable properties. And technology evolution, in fact, any process that is truly an evolutionary process, is such a chaotic, dynamic system. And we see these smooth curves, and I say this now not just backfitting to past data, but making these forward-looking predictions for a long time. As the transistors have gotten smaller and cheaper, they've also gotten faster. So we've been doubling the price performance of electronics about every year. And the economists, that's 50% deflation. It's also true of other types of information technology, genetic technology, brain data. I mean, you point to a lot of different types of information technology. Software has a 50% deflation factor. The economists said there's no way we would actually double our consumption of information technology every year. We might buy a little bit more. Actually, what we find is we more than double it. We've had 18% growth in constant dollars in information technology for the last 50 years, more than keeping pace with this doubling of price performance. People didn't buy iPods for $10,000 10 years ago, which is what it would have cost. As the price performance reaches certain levels, new applications open up. Magnetic data storage, I just put this up here because this is not Moore's Law. This is not shrinking transistors. It's shrinking magnetic spots. Different scientists, same progression. Biotechnology, it's very revolutionary. We're really going to be able to reprogram our own biology. We have tools now to actually reprogram our genes. We can turn genes off with RNA interference. We can add new genetic information with reliable new techniques that overcome some of the earlier problems of gene therapy. We can turn on and off enzymes. It costs $10 per base pair. In 1990, it's a penny today. The amount of genetic data, this slope on this log chart represents doubling every year. That's continued past the collection of the genome. Communication, I mean, I don't have time to describe this in detail, but there's 50 different ways to measure it: wired, wireless, number of bits, amount of capacity, bandwidth, all basically doubling every year. So if we have enough data, we can see the ripples of S-curves. I had a little bit of this chart of the internet called then the ARPANET in the 1980s and predicted in my book, Age of Intelligent Machines, which I wrote 20 years ago, that there would be a worldwide communication network comprising tens of millions of people emerging in the mid-1990s. That seemed absurd at that time because it was 10,000 nodes doubling to 20,000 used by a few thousand scientists. And if you looked at it in a linear graph, this is what that same data looks like. And then in the early 90s, people said, well, you know, your projection is only a few years from now, and still nothing is happening. But when you're doubling these little numbers, nothing is happening. Even though a exponential is smooth, no discontinuities, it ultimately becomes explosive. And by the mid-1990s, the internet did take off. We're shrinking technology at an exponential rate, according to my models, a factor of 100 per 3D volume per decade, both electronic and mechanical. I don't want to dwell on this, but these are some projections from Eric Drexler's seminal book, which I just got a signed copy of, and it's got a prominent place in my office, Nanosystems from 1986. But I give hundreds of examples in my book of working nanosystems. This is not speculative anymore. There was speculation at the Spiritual Machines conference. One scientist created a little robot that walks with a convincing gait at the molecular level. It looks like a human gait. Another scientist built a device which you put thousands of them in the bloodstream of animals, of rats, and it cures type 1 diabetes, has 7 nanometer pores, lets insulin out in a controlled fashion, blocks antibodies because type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disorder. The idea of blood cell-sized devices performing sophisticated therapeutic functions might sound very futuristic. There are 4 major conferences on biomems to do exactly that. At MIT and at the University of Rochester, there's a tiny nano device that can detect the specific antigens on the surface of a particular type of cancer cell, latch onto the cell, burrow into the cell, detect that it's inside the cell, release toxins, and destroy the cell. And those sequence of 4 or 5 steps of these nano-engineered systems has been demonstrated in vitro, and it's going into animal trials. And that's today. And if you then contemplate multiplying the power of these technologies by 1 billion in 25 years, which is what this doubling every year amounts to. Actually, that would be 30 years, but it's actually a little faster than that. While we shrink the size of these technologies by a factor of 100,000 in 25 years, and look at what we can do already, you get some idea of what will be feasible by the late 2020s. This is an animation of a robotic red blood cell. Red blood cells is a biological system we've reverse engineered. We understand them. They're not that complex. And it does bring up an issue about biology that it's very intricate, but it's also very suboptimal. And when we can re-engineer these systems, we can make them much more capable. A conservative analysis of these robotic respirosites that Rob Friedis has designed indicates you could do an Olympic sprint in 15 minutes without taking a breath if you use these, or sit at the bottom of your pool for 4 hours. So Honey, I'm in the Pool will take on a whole new significance. He's designed a robotic white blood cell. I don't have time to describe all these, but if you look at what's already happening, there are some very sophisticated nanosystems that are being demonstrated. Now, really understanding the principles of operation of the human brain has been difficult. You can't, up until recently, you can't do that with fMRI, getting fuzzy pictures of seeing, where there's activity when you do certain types of thoughts or mental activity. But we're doubling the spatial resolution of brain scanning every year. I describe a number of new scanning technologies in the book. One at the University of Pennsylvania allows you to see, for the first time, interneuronal connections, see them signaling in real time in a living brain. And we're getting the data to actually begin to understand how the brain creates our thoughts. But my proposal is not just to reverse engineer the human brain and sort of thoughtlessly just put those algorithms on a suitable computational substrate. We have an existing AI toolkit. It's increasingly powerful. We're doing things today that were impossible even 7 years ago. We're just beginning to get hints from brain reverse engineering. When we got data on the front end, transformations of auditory data from the auditory cortex, we put that into our speech recognition, got dramatically better performance. It was actually counterintuitive. These transformations are not what we would have predicted. But after we got them, we saw why those transformations are being made. And so we got that hint, or that set of principles, from having reverse engineered the auditory cortex, or that portion of it. And that was very helpful in this particular narrow AI application. So we're going to expand the AI toolkit from ongoing AI research. We'll have hints and ideas and models coming from reverse engineering the human brain. We will study the performance of the human brain itself. One good laboratory for that is studying human language, which does manifest all the hierarchical, symbolic types of structures that human thought is able to deal with. In fact, Turing based his Turing test on human language. Brain scanning is growing exponentially in resolution, and the amount of data is doubling every year on the brain. And Doug Hofstadter has posed the question, well, are we smart enough to understand our own intelligence? And, are we above or below that threshold? Clearly a giraffe's brain, Doug points out, is below that threshold. Maybe we were also below that threshold. Our ability to reverse engineer and model already 20 regions out of the several hundred regions that exist of the brain, and the fact that we can create technology, I believe, puts us over that threshold. This is a model and a detailed mathematical model and computer simulation of 12 different regions of the auditory cortex, and then applying sophisticated psychoacoustic tests to the simulation gets very similar results to applying those tests to human auditory perception. Doesn't prove that the model is totally accurate, but it does show that we are capable of understanding the principles of operation, expressing them in the language of mathematics, and if we can do that, we can simulate them on suitable computational platforms. And the number of regions that's being simulated is expanding. We have a simulation of the cerebellum, and then applying skill formation tests to the simulation gets very similar results as applying those tests to human skill formation. The cerebellum is an important region and comprises more than half the neurons of the brain. And I'll come back to the significance of the cerebellum in a moment, because it does give us a good insight as to what the complexity of the brain is. Now, this number of ways in which the brain is really quite different from computers, and people often cite that, saying, well, computers can't simulate the human brain because it's massively parallel, it uses analog computing, it uses holographic forms of storage, there are very few cycles available to make decisions, it's self-organizing, but these are actually very good principles which we are beginning to utilize. And as we learn more about how these self-organizing principles work, we are incorporating them into modern AI programs, particularly pattern recognition. We use these self-organizing paradigms, and as we learn more about how the brain does its own self-organization, it gives us powerful insights and paradigms to apply to those pattern recognition methods. Now, a key point about the complexity of the brain, and this is really a very key point, because one of the objections is, oh, the brain is too complex. I mean, there's 100 trillion neurons and 100 billion neurons, 1,000 connections per neuron, 1,000 ion channels per connection. It's all these many nonlinearities. This is a level of complexity that's just way beyond today's technology. That is the apparent complexity if you look at a mature brain. But the design of the brain is a billion times simpler than that. How do we know that? Well, the design of the brain is in the genome. The genome has the design of the human body and brain. And it's 800 million bytes, but it's replete with redundancies. One sequence, ALU, is repeated 300,000 times. I show in the book how you can compress using lossless compression the genome down to 30 to 100 million bytes. So the genome, which describes the design of the body and brain, has 30 to 100 million bytes, which is less than Microsoft Word. And it's not, my point is not that it's a simple system, but it's a level of complexity that we can handle. And how do you get a brain that's much more complex than the design it starts with? Basically, it's a probabilistic fractal. It expands itself through a lot of stochastic or random processes. And the cerebellum is a good example. The cerebellum basically says, the genome says the following about the cerebellum. Well, let me back up. If you look at the cerebellum, you'd say, my God, this is a vast amount of complexity. How could we ever hope to understand this? You just see trillions of these incredibly tangled bundles of connections. It looks like this vast system that's just beyond our intelligence to understand. We understand it because there's actually only tens of thousands of bytes of design information. The genome says the following about the cerebellum. It says there's 4 different types of neurons that are organized kind of like this in one cell. Now repeat that 10 billion times and add a little bit of random variation within the following constraints with each repetition. That is what the genome says about the cerebellum. And we actually understand that. We've modeled it mathematically, and that's behind this simulation of the cerebellum. I mean, an example of a fractal, and Doug has written extensively about these. I mean, this is the Mandelbrot set. You've probably seen pictures of it. It looks very complex. how much information is in the Mandelbrot set? Well, if you take the image, it's a vast amount of information. And depending on the resolution, it can just be an indefinitely vast amount of information. The design of this is 6 bytes long. And similarly, because as it's iteratively applied, a fractal expands its information. The brain is actually a probabilistic fractal. There's a lot of random processes as it expands its information. And it's self-organizing. This largely randomly wired cerebellum then interacts with a complex environment, and the child learns to walk and to talk and to catch a fly ball, and it gets filled up with meaningful information. Models often get simpler at higher levels. Modeling one pancreatic islet cell, it's very complex. Modeling the whole pancreas is much simpler, and there is an artificial pancreas in FDA tests. And the same thing is applied to these brain models. And you have to apply the abstractions at the right level. Biology is theoretically based on chemistry, which is based on physics, but you don't explain what a biological system does at the level of quarks or protons, maybe proteins. You have to model things at the right level. And neurobiology has its own levels of abstraction. In fact, there's several levels of abstraction in the brain with ideas at the highest level. And we are beginning to reverse engineer this. We are at the early stages, but this will be an exponential process. I won't dwell on this, but this is all driving economic gains. Productivity is increasing. In fact, it's that increase in the consumption of information technology, which is increasingly pervasive in all of our economic institutions, that's driving really all of the economic growth we're seeing. The adoption of these technologies is exponential. This is e-commerce, now $1 trillion. You might say, now wait a second, wasn't there a boom and a bust, which was experienced in this geographic area quite acutely? That was a Wall Street phenomenon. Wall Street looked at the internet and said, wow, this is revolutionary. It's going to change every business model. And the values went like this. 3 years later, they came back and said, it hasn't changed all the business models. I guess we were wrong, and all the values went like that. The actual adoption was exponential, but remember, an exponential looks like nothing's happening until you get some real traction. Well, we're getting real traction now with e-commerce. So let me show you an example of another technology which we put together. We created the first large vocabulary speech recognition that was commercially marketed, and the first text synthesis. We put those together with language translation, created a translating telephone. The language translation actually has made a lot of progress. It's another example of how we've made exponential progress in the quality of software. Using more sophisticated pattern recognition techniques, I was at Google recently, and they applied it to this opportunity we have now for vast data mining. They took these very large Rosetta Stone texts and created a English to Arabic and Arabic to English translator that not only won the DARPA competition, but actually compared equally to human professional translators. And nobody on the team spoke a word of Arabic, basically using pattern recognition applied to very large databases. And this is actually my proposal for how we can do language, not with symbolic rules, which are very hard to do. When we did speech recognition, we knew there were 44 phonemes, we knew various phonetic rules and so on. We didn't tell the system what they were. We let it discover it by itself from vast databases using pattern recognition. So this will be a routine feature of your cell phone early in the next decade.
This is a demonstration, comma.
Dies ist eine Demonstration
Of a prototype of a quote translating end quote telephone. Period.
von einem Prototyp eines übersetzenden Telefons.
Within a few years, comma,
Innerhalb einiger Jahre
we will be able to talk to anyone, comma,
wir werden fähig sein, zu
regardless of their language. Period.
ohne Rücksicht auf ihre Sprache.
The rain in Spain, comma,
La pluie en Espagne.
stays mainly in the plain. Period.
Reste dans la plaine principalement.
Merci pour votre attention. Period.
Thank you for your attention.
So, excuse my French, but well, this is an image I had actually in the Age of Spiritual Machines without the dotted lines. In the Singularity is Near, I put dotted lines around those capabilities of computers that were soon to fall off. At the Gilded Conference, I was criticized for that only humans can drive cars. That was going to stay on the wall, but I did actually feel that would come down. Another progression that is of interest is we're already extending beyond our horizons. This is not a new phenomena. If it wasn't for technology, half the audience wouldn't be here. The other half would be senior citizens. But what I've principally tried to do in the Singularity is Near is deal with the objections that have come up to the Age of Spiritual Machines, and I really have only a few minutes to touch on these. One criticism is that it's just from incredulity that the results of exponential growth just seem too incredible. But that was true 20 years ago. That's equally true today. I do think people think linearly, and that's our intuitive view, but the intuitive view is not historically correct. People say exponential trends can't go on forever. Information technology transcends one paradigm to another, but even information technology has a limit. There are ultimate limits. I'd talk about what they are. Information technology will hit a wall, but not before it reaches pretty extraordinary levels. Just based on the types of technologies we can touch and feel today that are already working, this is without going into any speculative realms of quantum computing or other types of computing. In fact, you can even ignore molecular three-dimensional computing, which, as I say, is working. Just conventional chips will achieve strong, cheap AI in the 2020s. People say software AI is stuck in the mud. Computers still can't tell the difference between a dog and a cat, for example. But we are making steady progress in AI. There are hundreds of applications, as I mentioned earlier, deeply embedded in our economic infrastructure. This wasn't true 7 years ago when we had this last conference. These were all research projects at that time. And people really tend to discount each new accomplishment of AI. In the book, I deal with this perspective from many different vantage points. Software complexity on log scales is progressing exponentially. Chess was mentioned earlier, but the latest systems actually, their performance is not accounted for by the brute force increase in power. They actually have better software, better pattern recognition to make the terminal leaf decision, and maybe we'll come back and explain more what that means. Algorithms are progressing. We use them a lot. The early genetic algorithms had fixed genomes, unlike real biological evolution where it could add genetic information, reassign the meaning of genes, have other non-coding genes that control the expression of coding genes. We've added these types of innovations and getting actually much more dramatic results. It's a good laboratory to study evolution itself. It does show that you can get more intelligence out of less, but it's not a magic bullet. The proposal is not to just have some big GA create strong AI. It's one self-organizing paradigm among many that we can apply to this problem. And there's many different ways of looking at this. I'm on the Army Science Advisory Board, and the sophistication of the autonomous systems now being developed are far more complex and capable in software, not just hardware, than they were 5 years ago. The criticism from reliability, software is just too brittle, too crash-prone. We can and do create reliable systems, 9/11, intensive care systems, landing airplanes. The majority of airplane landings are controlled by software. The number of times a software crash or bug has caused an airplane crash is zero. The same is not true for human landings. If we create software technology that's decentralized and self-organizing, it's inherently very stable. And the quintessential example is the Internet. And the amount of time that the Internet has been down over the last decade is 0 seconds. People say the brain's too complex. I address this. Thomas Ray said it would take billions of lines of code to describe the brain. That's looking at this apparent complexity, not the complexity of the design, which is contained in the genome. And it's not a simple system, and we're not there. And because of the exponential progression, we have a long way to go, but we'll do it exponentially. But the amount of complexity is a level that we can manage. I won't deal with these because we don't have time. Let me say a few words about promise versus peril. The ethical guidelines do work for inadvertent problems. The Asilomar guidelines in biotech have kept us safe for 30 years. The Foresight Institute, which Christine heads up, has similar guidelines for nanotech. I believe they will work effectively. The big problem is advertent problems. That is actually a word. Designer pathogens, self-replicating nanotech, unfriendly AI, which Eliezer has written extensively and insightfully about, are really the key concerns. And there's a movement that, well, let's relinquish these technologies. They're just too dangerous. There are three problems with that, and I can only summarize it, but it would require a totalitarian system to implement. It would deprive us of profound benefits, and it wouldn't work. It would just drive these technologies underground where they'd be less stable, and the responsible scientists would not have access to the tools needed to defend us. The way we can defend ourselves is through narrow relinquishment of dangerous information and to invest explicitly in the defenses, something we've done with software viruses and which has actually worked quite well. And even though Bill Joy and I are often considered on opposite sides of this, we've actually worked together. Bill Joy got his ideas about the downsides from the age of spiritual machines. We recently wrote this op-ed piece in the New York Times criticizing the dissemination of dangerous information, specifically the 1918 flu genome on the web, which we thought should be given to the scientists who need it in confidence, and also calling for a Manhattan Project to combat biological viruses. And Majority Leader Bill Frist recently cited this op-ed and endorsed both of those proposals. Bill McKibben will speak later. He writes, is it possible that our technological reach is very nearly sufficient now, that our lives, at least in the West, are sufficiently comfortable? My view is no, not until we can meet our energy needs, which we'll be able to do with nanotechnology, nano-engineered solar panels and fuel cells, which can capture the only 1% of 1% of the sunlight that falls on the Earth to meet 100% of our energy needs in a clean, renewable fashion, overcome disease and death, overcome poverty, and a few other problems. Only technology, advanced, nanoscale, distributed, decentralized, self-organizing, increasingly intelligent technology, has the scale to solve these problems that human species has struggled with for eons. So let's say, okay, overcoming disease and disabilities, those are good things, but we shouldn't go beyond normal human capabilities. As I say, most of the audience wouldn't be here if we hadn't already gone beyond normal human abilities. I really have two responses to that. One is, what is normal? I mean, the guy who was whistling some music in the lobby of my hotel this morning, is that normal musical ability? I hope not. Or Beethoven and the Beatles, is that normal musical ability? There's a wide range of abilities, a wide diversity of abilities. Going beyond normal is not a new story. We are the species that seeks to go beyond our limitations. And people say death gives meaning to life, it gives meaning to time, but we really get meaning from what's unique about the human species is we create knowledge. That knowledge base is expanding exponentially. I've been at lots of conferences where scientists are very fond of saying, we're not unique, we used to think we were, the universe doesn't revolve around us, we're not descended from the gods, we're descended from primates, from worms, but we are unique after all. Those few tens of thousands of bytes of genetic information, which were the enabling factors for us to create technology, has enabled us to create an expanding knowledge base and expand our horizons. So in summary, I believe this takeoff is soft. I am a conservative in some quarters. Exponential growth, which will continue based on known physics of information technology and known paradigms and known technologies that are working without any speculative technologies, is gradual, incremental, smooth. There's no silver bullet, but ultimately will be profoundly transformative. Thank you very much.